This is Unbranded Christianity. My name is Matthew, and today we're going to be talking about all truth being God's truth. Thanks for joining. Today, a real big topic that is I'm so focused on and have been since college, which is over 10 years ago now, which is crazy to think about. And this was something that was introduced to me at college, and I've pretty much nonstop meditating on it for the last 10 years. It's the concept of all truth being God's truth. Okay? That sounds big. It is big. It should change the way you interact with God and others and ourselves kind of indiscriminately. The thought was introduced to me roughly around 2006, which would have been the second part of my freshman year of college, beginning of my sophomore year. And the principle of all truth being God's truth is that wherever you find truth, its origin is from God. Think about that for a second. Wherever we encounter truth, the origin of it is from God. This can single-handedly be the most freeing thought process of your Christian experience. I go about life with like a truth radar, basically. Like, it doesn't matter where I find it. When I do see a hint of truth, when I do find an ounce of truth, I acknowledge it to being from God. Now, in another video, I'll talk about how truth can be measured in terms of if it's true or not, and that's the all truth, the truth chapter on goo and do, which sounds funny, but it's good. I promise. It's a really helpful tool to measure when something is true or not. But what this means to me, when all truth is being God's truth, is I can find it in the most unsuspecting place and still acknowledge that the originator of that is God. So, for example, one of the areas that I really love encountering truth is media. Predominantly music. Second to that is movies. But the reality to me is that whenever we find truth in the most unsuspecting places, it can be something that resounds very loudly with a loving Father and a loving God. So, for example, the first time I really encountered this was in 2008. I remember in that summer, there's a song that came out by Korn, which growing up, that was kind of like, oh, that's the devil band, you know? And, you know, you fast forward to today, and the lead guitarist, Brian the Head Welsh, like loves Jesus. He holds altar calls at the end of concerts and prays for people, and people are getting healed. And he's like got a crazy cool story. But anyway, the song was Coming Undone, and it just came out, I think, that year. And I remember I was sitting there listening to it, kind of like, yeah, you know, rock and roll. And there's the line in there that says like, choke, choke again. I thought my demons were my friends, but in the end, they were always out to get me. And that's how I heard the lyrics. And I'm sitting there like, oh, demons were my friends, and then they're always out to get me. And the light bulb goes on. And I'm like, holy cow. That's truth. And I mulled on that, and it hit me like a lightning bolt. Like, oh my gosh, if there's truth found in a Korn song, where else is truth? And in that particular instance, that truth is very small. And I know that it's not a high concentration, but it's very obvious that if you take that and then you take the principles of like sin in Scripture, where you look at Scripture, how sin, sin feels good. Let's be honest. Sin feels good. Sin is just a really shallow well, though, right? It leaves you thirsty. It's like when you're thirsty and you chug a huge pop and you're like, oh, I drank a lot. But ultimately, the long-term effects is that now there's a lot of sugar in your system. You feel a rush. and then you end up being more dehydrated because the sugar like dries you out a little bit. No, I know, super legalistic will be like, hey, you just liken sin to drinking pop. Um, just, it's an analogy. Don't go too rough on that. I mean, come on now. But it's this similar where it's good for this very small moment. Think of it like pornography. It's like, wow, this feels good. This looks good. This is great. And it's like this immediate endorphin rush. And, but what happens over time is then people stop being people and people start being viewed as physical attributes, and they start being viewed as sexual partners. And the sin in the immediate feels good. Sin in the long term becomes detrimental to how we view humans themselves and how we view ourselves and our own body. So what I thought was my friend, the demon that I thought was my friend, ended up in the end trying to kill me. And that was where my mind went. And I'm like, oh man, it's there. And then it started to change the way I view truth in general. So then, you're watching a movie. There's a movie called Big Fish, and it's got Ewan McGregor in it. It's a lesser known movie, but it so captures the heart of the Father in ways that just reading a book won't. And I remember there was a time where I was watching that movie, and at the end, I felt so loved and known by God. I was weeping and in tears. And I looked to my friends to my left and right, and they're also in tears, and they're also just feeling this love of God in that moment. And it just, once you start going down this path of recognizing that all truth is God's truth, and whenever it bubbles up, you can look at it and say, wow, thank you so much, God. It literally transforms the way that you do your devotions, that you do your interactions with God. It's going about your day, and when you see it pop up as truth, you can look at it and go, oh wow, God, you're here also. Because He is there also. And I personally believe, and later on I'll do a video on creativity, but I believe that in the creative search, God regularly speaks. I feel like I should say that again. In the creative search of opening ourselves up to creativity, God regularly speaks. And I think that's one of the reasons why when we pursue truth and we find it in the most unsuspecting places, it's because God is there in that process revealing Himself. In short, all truth is God's truth. And we as Christians, we need to tear down this idea that there's holy, and then you build the wall, and then there's secular. All creation was loved by God. For God so loved the world, He gave His only Son. That didn't say, for God so loved the the world that was covered by redemption. He didn't say, God so loved only parts of the world. God so loved the world that He gave His Son. And in that place, when we regularly, we tear down that wall, dividing the sacred and the secular, and we start to approach the world with this view that if there's truth here, it's from God, it will change the way we view interacting with God. And that's the bottom line. You don't just have to go to a service for 2 hours to encounter truth. You don't have to listen to a Christian podcast or read a Christian book or wear Christian clothes to encounter truth. You can quite literally be at a poker table and encounter truth. You can quite literally be in your car listening to secular music and encounter truth. And the goal in our lives is to see that God is at move all the time and in all places. And truth is just little lightning rods. It's like a lightning storm. It's like, oh, there's truth. Oh, there's truth. When you watch a lightning storm, it's like the lightning, boom, goes, and then light fills the sky. When truth is revealed, and all truth being God's truth, truth will always reveal God. It'll always, I'll go into that, I go into that deeper in another chapter on truth. But for us, truth illuminates. So whenever we encounter something that illuminates, it's from God. So I hope this helps. I hope this makes sense. And I hope that you, this week, as you go about your life, you begin to look for truth. It's my prayer that you look for truth elsewhere. That it's not just going straight to Scripture, but it's also going to the world around us, the revelation of a Creator. For some of us, that's going to the movies. For others of us, that's going on a bike ride and observing how creation reveals God and His truth. But it's a wide spectrum. You'll find God's truth in the most unsuspecting place, and it's still God's, because the light shines in dark places. And when you find the light, it's God. I hope this is encouraging. I hope this is challenging. I hope this helps restructure the way you approach encountering God. And honestly, even as I'm saying this, I hope that for some of you who have gone to the same well time and time again, and it feels like it's drying up or becoming old, I hope that this thought introduces new ways to encounter God and see Him in new light, and free you from the rote, typical thing that you've been hammered home on time and time again. And if that doesn't make sense to everyone, that's fine, but I hope it makes sense to the few of you that need that. Thank you for jumping in and watching Unbranded Christianity today. I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad you're here. And I really, really, really hope that this is encouraging and it helps you in your walk with Jesus to see that God is revealing Himself with His truth all over the place. And He's not bound to just a couple avenues, but He's everywhere. Blessings, have a good one, and thanks for joining in on Unbranded Christianity.